We all fall into our own kind of love with C.S. Lewis, and I had fallen into mine at 12 years old when I read the Screwtape Letters and Narnia. But C.S. Lewis only loved one woman enough to marry late in life. Only one woman he called the whole world. I wanted to know her story, and I wanted to tell her story. Who was this award-winning poet and novelist who'd lived a world away from Lewis, both culturally and literally, and yet they had fallen in love? Who was Joy Davidman beyond the movie version of her death, past the definitions others had bestowed on her? I soon became wholly enchanted by Joy and her life's journey, from an ex-atheist, ex-communist, married New Yorker with 2 sons to the wife of C.S. Lewis in Oxford, England. This was an improbable love story. Through research, writing, reading, and travel, I came to know Joy and Jack in a way I hadn't before. As I did my research, Joy often seemed not to care what others thought of her, but I did care. Her story matters for us today. I started with the words. Already fascinated with Lewis's work, I began to read Joy's writings. A literary star in her day, her poetry, essays, novels, and letters flamed with talent, pain, and insight. She was both fascinating and complicated. As my hunt deepened, I discovered that recently a stash of Joy's unpublished stories, essays, novellas, unfinished novels, and poems were found inside a closet in Oxford. Inside this little box was a sheaf of papers labeled Courage, which included 45 love sonnets she had written and then dedicated to C.S. Lewis. I immediately booked a trip to the Wade Center at Wheaton College, where these papers are curated. Alone in the Wade Center reading room, surrounded by Joy's handwriting, her letters, her poems, her divorce decree, and her passport, I began to capture her courage and fierce determination, as well as tap into the landscape of her heart. Time seemed to bend, and I wasn't alone in a reading room, but with Joy as she struggled. Here she was, a vulnerable woman trying to save her own life as she reached out to C.S. Lewis after a conversion experience. You see, for 3 years, Joy and Jack were pen pals before she sailed to England in 1952 and finally met him. All of those letters have been lost. So although I was writing with the backbone of research and the work of those who have come before me, imagination and inspiration filled the gaps. After years of research and feeling I had come to know her as well as I could without walking in her footsteps, I traveled to London and Oxford, to what I called the places of joy, where much of their love story unfolded. When I arrived in Oxford, I was immediately charmed, as anyone who first sets a gaze on this medieval city. I wandered the fabled streets of Oxford, trying to imagine how Joy must have felt 50 years ago when the city didn't look radically different than it does today. What was she thinking? How was she feeling on that very first day? My first stop was along High Street on the corner of Merton Street at the Eastgate Hotel, where Joy first met Jack face to face. I imagined her excitement and nerves as she arrived at that building, finally meeting the friend she so admired, a friend who had sustained her in hardships and in spiritual curiosity. Snapping photos, I followed what might have been their footsteps all through Oxford. There was Magdalen College, where they went on their first day together, where Jack was the tutor of English literature, a place of towers, pinnacles, and cloisters, an imposing fortress that includes the dining room, the High Anglican Chapel, the Deer Park, and the famous Addison's Walk, where Jack came to convert after a long night's discussion with Tolkien and Hugo Dyson. I stood there on Addison's Walk as spring tried to burst forth, and could only dimly imagine that night, and like Joy, how I wish I'd been there. From there, I went to Blackwell's bookshop, where Jack and Joy spent hours, as had Joy's sons Davy and Douglas after they moved there a year later. I found an original version of Lewis's A Grief Observed, when he'd published it under a pseudonym. I'd read that book so many times, but to see it in the city he'd written it in the place where he'd loved and lost the woman I was writing about, it all took on deeper meaning. These were not mere characters now, but living, breathing people traveling quietly alongside me. Still following Joy's footsteps, listening carefully for the sound of her heart, I punted on the Cherwell as they had many times with Jack's best friend Tolkien and whiled away an afternoon. I toured University College, where Jack had been a student, that atheist young man who was just starting his academic life. Then I ducked into the Eagle and Child, lovingly called the Bird and Baby, for a pint in the Rabbit Room, where Jack and Joy spent many afternoons and where the Inklings met on Thursdays. There was Holy Trinity Church, where I sat in the pew where Jack and Warnie usually sat, and where Jack claimed he had the inspiration for the Screwtape Letters. Outside, the beautiful cemetery beckoned with weathered gravestones and gardens. And I found Jack and Warnie's graves and stood for a while in the peace and beauty of that place. I then toured the kilns, where Jack and his brother Warnie lived for 33 years. The acreage and lake that inspired much of the Narnian Chronicles rested beyond with 8 acres of forest, lake, hills, and gardens. This is where Joy lived for the 3 years of their blissful marriage, and where Jack became an extraordinary stepfather to her sons. I almost felt them moving around the house as I wandered from room to room. I walked through all these places of joy, and I began to see and feel the landscape of not only their life, but also their love. What had seemed myth became real and solid, as did Jack and Joy become real. Their struggles and heartaches, their joys and despairs. Jack and Joy still seem very much alive in Oxford, as all along the way I was told stories of their wit and wisdom, of their love story, and of their influence. Many of the stories I heard weren't exactly true, but this is what happens when one becomes a legend. Eventually, as the novel neared its end, I met Joy's son, Douglas Gresham. We spent hours talking and writing about his childhood, about the books he wrote of their life, about his extraordinary, complicated, intelligent, funny, and wise mother. I went looking for Joy's story in research, words, and landscape, and I found a woman who teaches us about the great and worthwhile struggle toward a passionate life despite society's expectations, about the value of love for other and self, and about the importance of the undivided life of a woman's soul seeking God. My novel, Becoming Mrs. Lewis, is a chance for Joy to emerge from the Shadowlands.